In this video, we'll show you how to configure dynamic fields in Business 360 Console. Configure dynamic fields when you want a set of fields to vary across the records in a business entity. Records that are related by a hierarchy or relationship asset contain the same set of dynamic fields. When business users create or update records in MDM SaaS applications, they enter the value for each dynamic field. For example, we can look at 2 item records in Product 360 that belong to different categories. This record for penny pasta has fields like pasta style, ingredients, and allergens. The record got these fields from the pasta and noodles category record. And this cell phone record has fields like color, display, processor, and screen size that it got from the no contract phones category record. To configure dynamic fields, you first create a dynamic pool. Add fields and field groups to the dynamic pool that you want to use as dynamic fields. Then add dynamic field definitions to category records. In this example, the no contract phones category includes the display and camera dynamic field definitions. When business users create a mobile phone record, they enter the display resolution and the camera modes that the phone supports. To configure dynamic fields, you create a dynamic pool in Business 360 Console. Add the dynamic field definitions attribute to a provider business entity, and then add the dynamic field values attribute to a consumer business entity. Records that belong to the consumer business entity contain dynamic fields based on the dynamic field definitions of their related records in a hierarchy. A record gets dynamic field definitions from its parent records when the business entities that the records belong to use the same dynamic pool. Let's jump into the demo. From the Business 360 Console homepage, create a dynamic pool. Add the fields and field groups that you want to use as dynamic fields. Next, go to the Explore page and open a provider business entity. Add a dynamic field definitions attribute to the business entity. Enter the general properties and select the dynamic pool to associate with the attribute. To configure how records inherit dynamic field definitions, select the business entity, dynamic field definition, and hierarchical relationship type. In this example, category records can inherit dynamic field definitions based on the category-to-category relationship. Verify that the hierarchy you want to use is searchable. In MDM SaaS applications, users can view the dynamic field definitions and inherited definitions on the hierarchy workspace. Next, go to the Explore page in Business 360 Console and open a business entity. Expand the dynamic field section. Add a dynamic field values attribute and enter the general properties. Select a provider business entity that contains dynamic field definitions attributes. Then select the relationship between the provider and consumer business entities. When records are related through the selected relationship, the record that belongs to the consumer business entity gets the dynamic fields. To ensure that child records inherit dynamic field definitions and hierarchy filters on the search results page reflect hierarchy changes, run a process hierarchies job. You can configure survivorship for a dynamic field definitions attribute as a single object. You can configure survivorship for a dynamic field values attribute and expand it, similar to a nested field group. To display dynamic field definitions on a page, configure the dynamic field definitions component. Users can select the dynamic field definitions that they want to add to records. To display dynamic field values on a page, configure the Fields component and select the Dynamic Field Values attribute. And that's it.